Imagine a king so powerful that his very word was law, his name inspired fear, and his city was one of the wonders of the world. He ruled as if he were a god among men, convinced that nothing could challenge him. Now imagine this same king crawling in the fields, eating grass like an ox, with hair disheveled like eagle feathers and nails grown like claws. It sounds like the plot of a fantastic tale, doesn't it? But this is a true story, a testimony of what happens when human pride collides with divine sovereignty. The story of Nebuchadnezzar invites us to reflect on the limits of power and the danger of forgetting that every gift comes from something greater than ourselves. He wasn't just a king, he was the builder of Babylon, a city so magnificent that its name echoed through the centuries. Yet at the peak of his glory, his downfall was decreed. And it wasn't an ordinary fall. It was a plunge into the very essence of humility, where the most powerful man on earth had to acknowledge that he was merely a creation before the Creator. But how does a king reach the point of losing everything, even his humanity? And what did he learn from being turned into an animal? These questions take us on a fascinating journey filled with lessons that resonate to this day. Are you ready to discover what sovereignty, pride, and redemption truly mean? But first, do you want to explore more mysteries and curiosities of the Bible? Subscribe to our channel now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any content. Nebuchadnezzar was a name that made men whisper. He wasn't just a king, he was a force of nature. He ruled Babylon with an iron hand and a visionary mind, and his city was a masterpiece that seemed to defy the gods. Imagine walls so wide that chariots could race atop them, and gardens so elevated they appeared to float in the air. Anyone who beheld Babylon felt small, yet seduced by its grandeur. And at the center of it all stood him, a man who saw the world as his own canvas to paint. His rise to power was no accident. He marched over nations like a storm, destroying cities and bringing kings into captivity. Jerusalem was one such city, conquered and subjected to his will. The temple of God was plundered, and its sacred vessels taken as trophies for his gods. With every victory, the king's arrogance swelled, as if the world were a constant affirmation of his invincibility. After all, who could challenge the one who dominated everything he saw? Babylon in itself was a reflection of his ambition. The Hanging Gardens, considered one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, were a visual declaration that there were no limits to human power. But what was most impressive wasn't just what was built, but what it represented. Nebuchadnezzar's unshakable belief that he was the architect of the world. "This is the great Babylon that I have built," his voice thundered, and no mortal dared contradict him. Yet behind the scenes, there was something he didn't see. Though he thought he controlled destiny, every step he took was within the plans of the Most High. It is God who changes the times and seasons, removes kings and establishes kings. Daniel 2:21. But Nebuchadnezzar was blind to this truth. To him, Babylon's glory was a mirror of his own strength and intelligence. Thus the stage was set for a clash greater than any war Nebuchadnezzar had ever fought. He saw himself as a titan among men. But what he didn't realize was that his greatest battle would be against the creator of the universe. The pride that lifted him would be the same that brought him down. But how could such a powerful king be brought to the dust? Well, the story had only just begun to unfold, and the next chapter promised to be a lesson that would echo through all generations. Behind Nebuchadnezzar's grandeur lay a pride that grew like a weed, obscuring the true source of his power. He looked upon Babylon as an artist gazes at their masterpiece and thought, "There is no one like me." This arrogance fueled his achievements, but was also the root of his imminent downfall. As his deeds accumulated glory, his awareness of human fragility disappeared. The book of Proverbs warns, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." Nebuchadnezzar was unaware that these words mirrored his destiny. He didn't see that his own greatness was a temporary gift, not something he possessed by his own merit. But the Most High watched in silence, like a father waiting for the right moment to correct a rebellious child. Then came the dreams. The king's restless mind was visited by images that shook him out of his comfort zone. He saw a great tree rising to the heavens, symbolizing the fullness of his glory, only to be cut down by divine order. The dream was a clear warning, But Nebuchadnezzar, blinded by pride, chose to ignore the signs. After all, who dared to overthrow the most powerful king in the world? Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance wasn't just a mistake, it was a challenge to God's sovereignty. Each act of hubris was like a stone added to a tower that would inevitably collapse. But before the fall, there is always a moment when destiny begins to whisper in the corridors of power, and Nebuchadnezzar's next step would lead him to a direct confrontation with the divine hand. One night, while silence hovered over Nebuchadnezzar's palace, a dream came like a devastating wave. He was not a man easily frightened, but that vision left him deeply disturbed. He saw a gigantic tree, its sturdy trunk reaching the heavens, its branches spreading across the earth. Animals rested in its shade, and birds made their nests in its branches. It was an image of abundance and supremacy. But, as with all things in life, the dream suddenly changed. A heavenly messenger descended from the skies and proclaimed in a loud voice, "Cut down the tree and lop off its branches. Leave only the stump bound to the earth, surrounded by iron and bronze." The words echoed like thunder in the king's heart. The scene, which had once symbolized prosperity, was transformed into a vision of destruction. But the decree did not stop there. The messenger announced that the heart of a man would be taken from him and replaced by the heart of an animal, and 7 times would pass until the Most High was recognized as sovereign over all the kingdoms of the earth. Upon waking, Nebuchadnezzar was drenched in sweat, as though he had battled with something invisible. He summoned his magicians, diviners, and astrologers, but none could provide an explanation. His frustration grew with each passing moment. The king, who had always had all the answers, now found himself confronted by a mystery beyond human understanding. In this moment of anguish, he remembered Daniel, the servant of the Most High God. The prophet, who had previously demonstrated divine wisdom, now became the king's only hope. Daniel was brought to the palace and listened attentively as the dream was described. His expression grew grave, and the silence that followed was almost palpable. He knew that what he was about to say would not be easy for the king to hear. And so, with a voice both firm and compassionate, Daniel revealed that the tree represented none other than Nebuchadnezzar himself. The king would be brought down and humbled until he acknowledged that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdom of men. Daniel 4:25. The king listened in silence. His facial expressions betrayed little, but within him was a storm. He knew that Daniel spoke with authority greater than any human, yet pride held him back. Perhaps he believed that his achievements could alter the course of the divine decree. But how could one circumvent the hand of the one who sustains the universe? This was Nebuchadnezzar's dilemma: to listen and yield, or to ignore and face the consequences. When Daniel began to speak, his voice carried a mix of reverence and compassion. He knew his words would not merely convey information, but would mark a turning point in the king's life. "O king, the tree you saw represents you," he declared firmly. Every detail of the dream was unveiled, as if a curtain had been drawn back before Nebuchadnezzar's eyes. The magnitude of the tree symbolized his greatness, but it also highlighted the fragility that accompanies unchecked pride. Daniel did not hesitate to reveal that the command to cut down the tree was a direct decree from the Most High. "You will be driven away from men," he continued, "and you will eat grass like the oxen, and 7 times will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High rules over the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he pleases." It was a hard truth, like a sword that cuts while also freeing. Daniel knew that the king's pride would be his downfall, but he also knew that this fall would mark the beginning of his redemption. However, there was a glimmer of hope. Daniel pointed to the stump of the tree that remained in the ground, bound with iron and bronze. This symbolized that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom would not be destroyed forever. God, in his infinite mercy, would preserve the essence of his kingdom, awaiting the moment when the king would submit to divine sovereignty. But the prophet did not stop there. He advised Nebuchadnezzar to repent. "Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue." Daniel 4:27. The king listened in silence. His facial expressions betrayed little, but within him was a storm. He knew that Daniel spoke with authority greater than any human, yet pride held him back. Perhaps he believed that his achievements could alter the course of the divine decree, but how could one circumvent the hand of the one who sustains the universe? This was Nebuchadnezzar's dilemma: to listen and yield, or to ignore and face the consequences. Daniel left the palace with a heavy heart. He knew that God's sovereignty would prevail, but not without the king undergoing a painful lesson. The interpretation had been given, the warning was clear, but Nebuchadnezzar's future still hinged on his decision. And so time began to move forward, like a divine clock counting down the days until the fulfillment of what had been decreed. Days passed, and Daniel's words seemed to fade like leaves carried by the wind. Nebuchadnezzar returned to his routine, ruling with the same pride that had led him to disregard divine counsel. After all, there was no sign that his glory was in danger. He continued to walk through the halls of his palace and gaze upon Babylon, convinced that his kingdom was unshakable. But time is relentless, and what seemed forgotten was about to return with overwhelming force. A year after the dream, the scene repeated itself. Nebuchadnezzar, in a gesture of unrestrained arrogance, walked along the terrace of his palace. Gazing upon the vastness of Babylon, he declared, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence, by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" Daniel 4:30. His words echoed as a direct challenge to the Most High, and heaven's silence would not last much longer. While the words were still on his lips, a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you." Daniel 4:31. In that instant, the divine decree came into action, and what seemed like an ordinary day became the start of an unprecedented humiliation. The king's mind was transformed, and he lost all capacity for human reason. The one who once sat on the world's most powerful throne now crawled through the fields, living like a wild animal. Banished from the company of men, Nebuchadnezzar lived among the animals, eating grass like the oxen. His hair grew long, like the feathers of an eagle, and his nails became like the claws of birds. The transformation was so complete that even those who had once feared him now saw a degraded figure. The king who had once been the focus of acclaim now dwelt in the silence of humiliation. But this time of disgrace was not merely punishment, it was a period of learning. Over the span of 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar endured the most profound humiliation, a journey that forced him to reflect and acknowledge that all power and glory belonged to the Most High. Even in his lowest state, his survival was a reminder that God's hand still upheld him. Each sunrise offered Nebuchadnezzar an opportunity to lift his eyes to heaven, but the process of humility was slow. The pride that had distanced him from God was like a wall that had to be dismantled, stone by stone. During this period, Babylon waited in silence, as if holding its breath for the moment when its king, finally broken, would turn to the Most High. 7 years passed. It was not an arbitrary duration. It was the time required for Nebuchadnezzar's hardened heart to begin to soften. He underwent a cycle that many avoid, confronting humiliation as a tool for growth. God was not in a hurry. Like a patient potter, he molded the king's heart at the right pace. During this period, God's silence was as deafening as the lessons he taught. There were no grand visions, no oracles, only the slow rhythm of days in the field, the wind, the grass, and the void. A void that echoed a truth Nebuchadnezzar could no longer ignore. Without God, all human glory is fleeting. The man who once saw himself as a god among men was now forced to face the fragility of his existence. Yet even in what seemed like abandonment, God was preparing the next chapter. Because let's face it, divine humiliation is never permanent. Every trial has a purpose, and what God accomplished in Nebuchadnezzar's life serves as a reminder that the end of one season often marks the beginning of another. But what would happen when he finally lifted his eyes to heaven? That, my friend, is a story still unfolding. One day, after 7 long years of darkness, something changed. Nebuchadnezzar lifted his eyes to heaven. It was a simple gesture, but profoundly symbolic. It was not just a physical movement, but an act of surrender. Who would have thought that the man who once exalted himself as a god would now seek the true God? At that moment, he realized that sovereignty belongs solely to the Most High. There in the middle of the field, he experienced what so many seek in vain amidst luxury: peace. In recognizing God, Nebuchadnezzar found something the palaces of Babylon could never provide. Suddenly, his sanity was restored. But it wasn't merely the return of reason, it was the rebirth of a heart that had learned to submit. The king, now with a clarity he had never before possessed, began to glorify the Most High. He who once exalted his own achievements now declared the majesty of God. There was no more room for pride. He had tasted divine greatness and knew it was incomparable. This moment was more than a personal revelation. It was a public testimony. The man who once mocked the God of Israel now proclaimed his glory. Babylon watched in astonishment as their king paid homage to the Creator. Nebuchadnezzar's once hardened heart now overflowed like a fountain, but his restoration was not discreet. The kingdom that seemed lost was returned to him, this time with a lesson etched deeply into his heart. Those who surrounded him witnessed something extraordinary. A man who acknowledged that his position was not earned, but granted by divine grace. It was as though all of Babylon gained a new perspective through its leader. The humility he now bore made his power even more legitimate. His subjects honored him in a way they never had before. The glory he now carried was no longer a facade of arrogance, but a reflection of God's sovereignty in his life. And as with all great stories, there is always something to learn and apply. Nebuchadnezzar's journey did not end with his restoration. It came with a new calling: to live and lead with the awareness that God is sovereign and that the power of true humility connects us to something far greater than any earthly empire. The story of Nebuchadnezzar is not just about a powerful king. It is an eternal reminder that pride comes before a fall, but humility can lift us to heights we never imagined. The king of Babylon learned this the hard way, but his transformation teaches a lesson applicable to us all. If there is one legacy Nebuchadnezzar leaves us, it is the certainty that no throne, title, or achievement can withstand the weight of pride. He thought he was in control, but he was confronted with the truth. God reigns, and everything is in his hands. Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation became the stage for God's glory. When he finally acknowledged his smallness, God exalted him in a way that surpassed any earthly glory. In the end, Nebuchadnezzar's journey resonates with a timeless truth. There is no greatness greater than recognizing God's sovereignty in our lives. His story stands as an eternal monument to divine grace, but also as a warning. Pride brings us down, but humility raises us to heights only God can lead us to. The journey of Nebuchadnezzar is more than an ancient tale. It is a living legend that echoes in every corner of the human heart. In losing everything, even his sanity, he found what pride had always hidden: the truth that supreme power does not belong to men, but to the Most High. When he finally lifted his eyes to heaven, Nebuchadnezzar saw what had always been before him, but which pride had blinded him to recognize. His words of praise to the Most High not only restored his sanity, but also his dignity. Perhaps you are not building walls as grand as Babylon's, but the Babylons of the heart are real. Too often we elevate our ego, blindly trust in our own strength, and ignore the warnings life presents. You may not hear a voice from heaven, but the signs are there, in moments of failure, loss, or silence. Nebuchadnezzar teaches us that no situation is so low that divine grace cannot restore it. The fall was necessary, but redemption was inevitable. And so it is with us. If we recognize God's sovereignty, we can turn our failures into stepping stones for a greater future. So what is the final lesson? That the most powerful man in the world had to crawl like an animal to learn that the greatest power of all is humility before God. Because true greatness is found when we surrender to the author of all things.